Can I welcome to the stage, please, you've seen him already speak today, John Jureidini, child psychologist. Remember, if you have questions, down here, Cara at the front has a microphone and we'll take your questions. I can also welcome to the stage, you haven't seen him yet, but he's got a fantastic speech coming up, Michael Wesley, who's the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He's also a former professor. He also used to work at the ONA, the Office of National Assessments, which you may know is the place that Andrew Wilkie pulled himself out of before over Iraq War. So interesting stuff there. We'll put you in that later, Michael. But look, I wanted to start with John. John, your speech was about compromise and about getting rid of compromise and not always, accepting that as necessarily a good approach. And I think your examples from the children's court were fantastic examples, and you could really understand it there. But when you start talking about something in the broader sense, though, like Israel versus Palestine, and you start saying, let's get rid of compromise then, doesn't that simply amount to choosing a winner, in a sense, like going this side or that side wins?
Yes, I think it does. But at the moment, I think we've got lots of losers anyway. And also, I think that if the world community were forced to make that choice, I think they would be forced to go in a particular direction.
So you're saying you think they'd go in the Palestinian direction, do you? Because there's a lot of powerful forces that may disagree with you there.
Yeah, but I think those powerful forces assert their influence partly through this illusion that what we're being offered is some kind of fair compromise. And I think that's actually a sham. So
in actual fact, if you're forced to choose between two polar opposite decisions, it will actually mean you're more likely to get the just decision. Is that what you're saying in a sense?
Well, there won't always be a just and an unjust decision. I mean, I think you're tying me down on one particular example. But
putting words in your mouth, John, sorry.
But I think there's more chance of getting a just solution if we're pushed into making the hard decision than if we keep having the option of being seen to be compromising.
I'm going to bring Michael in here because he knows a great deal more about me than international policy. What do you think about the idea that in these areas that we have this constant compromising, which essentially just means that the problem goes on and on forever? The example of Israel and Palestine being one of them.
Look, I think there are compromises and compromises. I enjoyed John's talk very much, but I do agree that there are times when compromises are a squib. They're a way of politicians weaseling away from choices that they really do need to make, and they're actually evidence of political cowardice. But on the other hand, I think that quite often a lot of political issues do have irreconcilable positions, and where you do get a bunch of winners, you also get a bunch of losers. And I think that's when compromise can be most usefully put into practice.
I guess you say it's a kind of irreconcilable differences there. Does that mean that compromise essentially just patches it up for many years? I mean, Israel-Palestine, does anyone actually see a solution ever occurring there?
Well, I guess part of the problem is that each side, and there are so many examples of this in world politics, each side sees a victory for the other as an absolute loss for themselves. And so there does need to be a long way to go in that particular conflict to change both sides' definitions of the problem, I think.
The other idea you brought up, I guess, John, was the idea that, that what is most popular is not necessarily the right decision, and that's often the case. And I know I've spoken to one politician in the past who says that, if capital punishment was put to the vote, you would, generally speaking, have a legalisation of capital punishment. It's almost as if politicians or various people try to keep things out of the popularity polls because they want to protect it from the wrong decision, in a sense. But how do you think we can actually, in a democratic country, it's very hard to say, oh, we're going to keep this out of the voting sphere, we want to keep this away from the dirty masses and their opinions. How do you think we actually do make it so that the right decision can prevail even in this democratic popularity contest?
Well, I think we've seen that kind of leadership. I mean, I don't think, because we lived with Howard for all those years, and because Rudd seems to be copying Howard as busily as he can, we've got out of the habit of seeing politicians who can actually exercise leadership and can take the community with them towards a direction of honesty and truth.
The difference between leading the community and following the community, you mean, I guess, yeah.
Absolutely.
There are those, I guess, that see a poll and say, well, I better react to that. And there are those that say, I see a poll, I better try and change. I mean, I think Paul Keating was probably always fell on the side of saying, well, the community's got to start agreeing with me in the end. What do you see? Do you see that? Is that a problem as much in something like international policy? Do you see that as a problem, Michael?
Look, it's a problem in all policy. This problem has been with us for a very long time. You know, over 200 years ago, a guy called Edmund Burke wrestled with this problem, and he actually came up with the solution. And he said the solution is election. The people exercise their judgment to elect people to a parliament, and then the people that they elect to the parliament have to exercise their own judgment, have to do what they think is right, rather than to go back to the people all the time. And I actually think that the advent of opinion polls is not a good thing for making good policy, because it does lead to, let's call it, a tendency to take too much notice of what the opinion polls are saying.
Well, it's interesting, Michael, because I won't give... This is not the argument of your speech, but one area that Michael's speech may kind of touch upon is the growth of interactivity with politics through things like blogs and Twitter. It's as if people are becoming more interactive and actually becoming passionate or part of their political system again. Now, in a sense, does that go against what we've just been saying here, that by rather than saying, okay, we've heard the people and now we've got 3 years to ignore them until we have to worry again, if we're now having to read the blogs and the Twitters and the opinion polls and the news.com.au polls, does that actually mean that the government is forced to be more reactive to the constant needs of people than it would have been otherwise?
I think that's the immediate effect of what's happening. The fact is that there are now new media platforms out there that allow people to follow, particularly in the United States, every conversation that their representative has and every meeting that their representative has. Now, in some ways that might be a good thing. That might stop certain packages of money changing hands at the wrong time. But on another level, I don't think we really want a politics in which our representatives are having to justify to a bunch of followers every single meeting that they have and everything they say in that meeting.
Yeah, no, it's true. I follow Joe Hockey on Twitter, and it's not good. Although nowadays you have to go to Andrew Robb's Twitter feed to get the details. But look, it's interesting because this may have been slightly before, but your time, in a sense, when you were working within the ONA, within that kind of government organisation and that, did you get a sense that, did you find yourselves thinking, well, I'm responding or I'm having to deal with this problem because 100 emails have fallen on the desk of the Prime Minister or the Minister or that kind of thing? So did you feel, even at that stage, which I think was pre-Twitter and pre a lot of these blogging and that, not that I'm saying you're old or anything, but no, when you were there, did even the interactivity allowed by email affect what you were having to deal with?
Just about ONA, Craig.
It's totally secret, so I'm going to get killed
Absolutely,
for asking the question.
But I'm going to tell you a national secret. Andrew Wilkie was working in the branch that I was running, and he left a month after I joined, which I take as a real comment on my leadership style.
Yeah, exactly.
Thankfully, no one's left the Lowy Institute
It's
yet.
either
but I'm
you or
expecting
the
it
Iraq
any time.
War. We still don't know which
That's
one.
right. Look, we were always aware that this was the period of the Howard government, that there were certain issues that they were extremely sensitive about. And we knew that whenever any of those issues came up, that they would have maximum political pressure on them. And it really made us sit up and do more on particular issues. But I can't tell you which ones.
No, I can't even imagine. Just going back to John for a second, you've been a big critic over the years of the medication for children and that kind of thing. Do you think, are we heading in that direction of much more medication being put on children in your particular field?
Actually, I think we may have peaked and we may be moving in Australia anyway, possibly in the other direction, although that's not something we can feel at all complacent about. But I think the sceptical view about the fact that medications are an appropriate response to distressed children is gaining some strength.
So you think it's not, because I know in America there's a lot of concern that it's influenced a great deal by the pharmaceutical companies, and I notice on your website you say, I've never taken money from pharmaceutical companies for your research. So is it not the same influence here in Australia to sign people up to certain drugs who are kids?
Well, we're not as big a market, so I don't think there's as much energy put into it. But I mean, we've got all of the same kinds of international problems about the way that we doctors interact with the pharmaceutical industry. And, you know, it's not about bashing that industry, because they have a responsibility to their shareholders to make a profit. It's we doctors who should be alert to the conflicts of interest, because our primary responsibility is not to ourselves but to our patients.
Just to touch on another issue that John brought up, and that I guess goes to what Michael's talking about as well. And remember, you can ask a question. Does anyone come on forumers, come up the front and ask a question? I can't do it all myself. Look, Cara, do a dance with that microphone. No, I just want to touch on, I guess, the idea of going back to compromise. And when it comes to something like climate change and the climate change debate, do you think that compromise is essentially the denialist winning? Is a compromise in that area just not enough to actually make a solution that's going to turn it round?
Well, I think that's always a danger with compromise. And I don't want to present the view that compromise is always wrong. But what I'm saying is that we should be suspicious and sceptical about compromise, as a kind of cop-out. And I think you're absolutely right. If you take an average position between what's saying taking a denialist approach to climate change and taking a responsible approach to climate change, then maybe that average is not worth pursuing.
Just to you, Michael, I guess, again, from an international policy perspective, to what extent are environmental issues, when you actually start looking at nation states talking to each other at various conferences and trying to deal with the problems and the conflicts between themselves, to what extent is environmental problems, or are environmental problems, actually part of the discussion? Is that, is it in the top 10 of the problems they actually care about, or is it kind of outside?
It's certainly a set of problems that more and more countries are concerned about. I certainly think that a country like China, for instance, the number one priority is development. Number two priority is probably political stability. But I think the environment is increasingly making its way up to the top of the scale.
Why? There seems to be a lot of argument about whether China is, squibbing on things like Copenhagen, but there's other people who are saying, in actual fact, China is the people who are investing the most in kind of alternative technologies in that. Do you see that as being a fear of the environmental problems, or is that a canny economic decision that has been made by China to kind of go stall, but when it comes to it, we're going to be at the front?
Oh, look, I think it's a bit of both. I would pick as one of the big issues to watch over the next year or two is the emergence of serious competition in green technology. I think China is right up there. I think the United States is right up there. Europe's really forging ahead.
And Australia are down there somewhere.
Look, we're coming through. We're coming through. But
we can't even swap bikes together, we've discovered today. We are so far behind on so many. I'm glad we've had this conference, because we have established that on a lot of the ideas we're quite behind on them. So,
But in terms of a solution here, Craig, one of the big things that's happening here, and in terms of a solution to climate change, we are going to have to see a certain type of compromise, and that is the compromise where all of the countries of the world come together and say everyone has to reach a certain per capita level of emissions. And the bad news for us is our per capita emissions have to dive, and seriously dive. And China and India and some of these big developing countries, their per capita emissions can rise. So we're both going to have to converge on an agreed per capita emissions basis.
It's one of the great ironies that when you see people talk about alternative energies, Australia is one of the countries that seems to have the most capacity. We have lots of wind, we have lots of sun, we have lots of waves, and yet we're also the country that has so much cheap coal that we actually take no interest in these alternative energies at all.
Absolutely. And I think we had a speaker at the Lowy Institute a few weeks back. That's a shameless plug.
Shameless plug there, well done.
Sorry about that. But he said that the technology that is going to solve global warming hasn't even been invented yet. So that's something to kind of think about.
There's a depressing idea worth sharing. Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Michael Wesley and John Jureidini. Michael Wesley is coming up in the afternoon session. Got a fantastic speech about passion. Sounds very sexy, I know.